Well, again, I want to start off this morning by diving straight into verses 1 through 4 of John chapter 6. It says, "After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him, because they saw the signs he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand." There is a golden Old Testament thread woven into the fabric from the end of John chapter 5 all the way through John chapter 6. And that golden thread is Moses and the Exodus. The Exodus, when God rescued his people from Egypt and led them to the promised land. Now, backing up a little bit, we left off last week with Jesus challenging the religious leaders about their apparent dedication to Moses and the law and the scriptures, and Jesus let them know he didn't need to accuse them about their lack of love of God, because Moses and the scriptures themselves accused them about it. That's where this golden thread starts. Now here in John chapter 6, we're given a glimpse into the second Passover that John mentioned. So this is a year later than the previous Passover that he mentioned. And in this one chapter, it might be seen, you might take a look at, did you read all of John chapter 6? I encouraged you to do that recently. If you take a broad view of it, if you look at it in whole, it might be seen as the Exodus revisited. Have you ever noticed that about John chapter 6? The Exodus revisited. Now remember, Passover, it's telling us here, or John tells us that it was at hand, so it's near. It's almost that time. Now, they're not in Jerusalem, so the Passover isn't here yet. It's near the time of the Passover. And remember, Passover was the great event that initiated the great Exodus of God's people from Egypt. But it didn't take long for the people to quickly go astray. And then they ended up wandering in the desert for 40 years. In the desert for 40 years, where God provided manna from heaven and quail for meat. And here in John chapter 6, Jesus feeds over 5,000 people with bread and fish, and then he will later talk about being the bread from heaven. Next week, we'll read that Jesus walks on the water of the sea, evoking thoughts and memories of when God parted the sea and Moses led the people on dry ground through the sea. In a few weeks, we'll see a revolt within Jesus' large group of followers. It's one of the most stunning passages of Scripture that just struck me maybe 25, 30 years ago. I haven't been able to take my mind off of what happens at the end of John chapter 6. And we're going to see this revolt within Jesus' large group of followers, which harkens back to the revolts that we can find when the Israelites revolted against Moses and his leadership back in that desert. Here, people recognize and call Jesus the prophet, referring to the prophet, the one prophet that Moses prophesied about. So there's one coming like me. And also here, Jesus first goes up on the desert mountainside with his disciples, just as Moses did with his elders back in that desert. And then later on, Jesus will withdraw up to a mountain by himself, just as Moses would on Mount Sinai, to be alone in the presence of God. So this whole of chapter 6, all of John, we're calling it Belief for Life. That's the series title. But this John chapter 6, we're taking 4 weeks to cover this chapter. It's like a sub-series within the Gospel of John, a sub-series we could call the Exodus Revisited. But here, it's Jesus who is the sacrificial lamb, the Passover lamb. It's Jesus who is the bread of life. It's Jesus who will rescue his people and then lead them from enslavement to sin through the impassable sea, separating them from God to a true life of true freedom and eventually into the eternal promised land. It's Jesus who's going to do all that. It is Jesus who is the true prophet, and it's Jesus who defeats our real enemy and becomes the true king that they'll want to make him king by the end of this passage this morning. And all of that and more is sewn into the fabric of this one chapter like a golden thread, written down by John, but inspired by the Holy Spirit for us today. And for this week, and we're just focusing on the first 15 verses, we're going to find that golden thread sparkling with the extravagance of God's merciful provision. And we just read verses 1 through 4. In verses 5 through 9, we're going to find our first contrast, natural versus spiritual sight. Verse 5 through 9. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" And he said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. And Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. And one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" We have a contrast here of natural versus spiritual sight. And as Jesus lifts his eyes to the crowd, there is something immensely spiritual going on. He's the God who made these folks. All things were made through him. He's the God who stepped out of eternity and into humanity to live the perfect life that these people couldn't, and then eventually die their death for them. So there's something immensely spiritual going on here. And while he is considering their eternity, and while he is considering their spiritual needs here, you notice that he also cares enough to be concerned about their natural, physical needs. Not just about their eternity, but also their hunger in this moment, that day, on that hillside, mountainside. Stop there and look. Picture in your mind what is going on. That mercy that Jesus has for these folks is remarkable. And Jesus didn't look up from the mountain and the hillside and see this huge crowd coming around the lake toward him. And he didn't think, "Hey, Andrew, I think we might get 15, 20,000 new followers today. I wonder if we can get them to like and subscribe. Maybe they'll follow us physically too." That's not what Jesus thought. That crowd coming around the lake toward him, he thought, "Hey, they must be hungry. They must be hungry." Now, Philip and Andrew have different eyes. And they're only engaging this scene with their natural sight. Now, I immediately read this, and I'm ashamed to admit it, but I'm honest enough to admit it. I might have responded exactly like Philip. And Jesus asked Philip where we ought to buy bread because Philip was from the nearby town there. That's why he turned to him. I might have responded exactly like Philip. Jesus is standing right next to him, right beside him. But Philip still only considered what his natural eyes could see. He saw the cards that were only face up on the table, so to speak. Okay, that's all he could see. And the thought behind Philip's reply seems to have been along the lines of this: What can our current limited funds afford? You recognize Philip's mindset? Is that where you live? I faced that this week. God is so good, rebuking me for my lack of faith. What can our current limited funds afford? That's really what was behind Philip's reply. Now, Andrew seems to go a shuffle step further than Philip, just a little more forward there. And he saw the same upturned cards on the table that Philip did, but at least he explored the options of how those cards might be played out. At least he considered what Jesus might do with those things that were at hand, even as incredulous as it was to him. So the thought behind Andrew's reply seemed to be, what can these meager resources do? What can these meager resources do? Do you recognize Andrew's mindset? Who am I? What do I have that's worth anything? What can I do? What can these meager resources do? Well, Jesus' actions replied to both of them, essentially saying, it is enough for me. Watch and learn to see with both natural and spiritual sight. Friends, to appreciate the extravagance of God's merciful provision and to live out the extravagance of God's merciful provision, we must seek to see the world with both natural and spiritual eyes, and then be prepared to respond to both the natural and the spiritual needs with God's mercy, with God's extravagant mercy. That sounds like a tall task, a tall order. But in verses 10 and 11, we find some much needed help with that in the contrast of natural versus spiritual supply. Verse 10 and 11. Jesus said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. As much as they wanted. And what we have here in the feeding of 5,000, this is the only miracle that is recorded by all four Gospels, aside from the resurrection. You had the feeding of 5,000 and the resurrection. Those are the only ones that are recorded in all four Gospels. Now, anyone who has studied this miracle, has read any of the four accounts of this, or studied this at any amount at all, you already know that the number 5,000 is apparently only a rough count of the men in the crowd. And so with the women and the children together, perhaps there was 15,000. Maybe there was even 20,000 people there. Now, we don't have to try to stretch that number out because Jesus feeding 5,000 out of these loaves and fish wasn't enough. It needs to be 20,000 before you're really going to capture my attention. That's not why we try to count these 15 to 20,000. Picture in your mind, have any of you ever been to a Pacers game, a playoff game, where it's packed in there, or maybe one against the Lakers or some other superstar team? Have you ever been in Gainbridge Fieldhouse or Market Square Arena when the Pacers were playing the Knicks in the playoffs? When those places are full, they're in the neighborhood of 15 to 18,000 people. Okay? So if you've ever been there and it's full, you have an idea of roughly what this crowd size was. Okay? Visualize it. So we have the crowd. Jesus is on the mountain or hillside above them. They've followed him all the way around the lake from the opposite side. This crowd gathered and walked all the way around the lake to meet him where he was. So he's on the hillside. They're sitting below him. You have that picture. Now I want to latch on to two peculiar words that John includes here. Much grass. There's something neat about this because the other Gospels mention this as well, and there's this sort of corroboration that's going on without them having talked to one another. So they're all remembering the fact that there is grass here. Linger on that for a moment. This scene is clearly a vivid memory in John's mind. There was much grass in the place. Again, he's not just recording historical things. He's remembering this vivid image. There's much grass in the place. It's a small but important detail. He's picturing it again as he recalls this scene. There's something about that made a lasting impression on John. We have the image of 15 to 20,000 people sitting on the grass in an otherwise arid desert because it's in the springtime, before Passover. It's in the springtime, before all the grass would soon dry up, while Jesus mercifully and wonderfully and extravagantly feeds and speaks to these folks, tending to their true needs. Now, for all that we get out of much grass that John did include here, there is something that John doesn't explicitly say, but is clearly implicit. And it's this. That boy mentioned back in verse 9, he had surrendered his loaves and fish. So what little natural supply he had, he gave it. He didn't hide it. He didn't hoard it. He returned to God what was God's in the first place, what God had chosen to place in his hands. And this boy's natural supply became a supernatural and spiritual supply when placed in Jesus' hands. Well, some of us look at scenes like this and we expect that there was some sleight of hand going on. Be honest. Like, somebody else probably brought some extra food. We can believe that Jesus did what appears to be a miracle. The people did get fed, but just like illusions and magic tricks, there must be a perfectly reasonable, rational, and natural explanation about what really happened, right? We just don't have those details. No. There is no rational explanation. There is no natural explanation about what happened. That's the point. That's why it's in here. This is a supernatural event, and it's one of the few signs that John chooses to record and leave in his gospel, and it's the fact that it is supernatural, which is why we're reading about it some 2,000 years later. John specifically chose this sign to include in his gospel that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Friends, if we limit ourselves to believing only the things that you can see with your natural eyes and things which you can fully understand, I don't say I hate to tell you. I love to tell you that you have actually very little to believe in. All of the things that you haven't seen with your own eyes, all of the things that you don't fully understand, all of those are off base for you to believe in. Listen, we have to realize something. All of us accept so much by faith, of one kind of faith or another. All of us. Everyone on the planet does it. So just make sure that where you're placing your faith is intentional, and you know where it is. Because we have trouble believing that Jesus fed 15,000 people from 5 loaves and 2 fish, then we're going to have trouble believing that he walked on water. That's next week, Lord willing. But also, if we doubt that Jesus multiplied what already existed, we're going to surely have trouble believing that he had actually made all things, the entire universe, every particle, atom, quark, every material, even the stuff that we can't directly observe. We call it dark matter, dark energy. We can see the effects of these things. We can't see them. So we call them dark matter, dark energy. He made all of that from absolutely nothing at all. There were no starting resources for him to start with and to multiply. There was nothing. There was zilch. There was nada. And then by his will and by his word alone, there was everything. And if we can't believe those things, it's no wonder that we can't bring ourselves to believe that his death and resurrection means your life and resurrection. But it is true. This is Jesus' magnificent, marvelous, extravagant, merciful provision. The entirety of Jesus' life, of his character, of his signs, his suffering, his sacrifice, his death, his burial, his resurrection, and his ascension. They are all facts, and they point to the reality of who Jesus is, and that is the revelation of an eternal lifetime. Because God's extravagant supply, it isn't only in feeding 15,000 people for a single day. It's his merciful provision and supply that made all of reality and all existence in the universe only to give himself and multiply his own offering to provide eternal salvation for a fallen world that didn't deserve one drop of his blood, yet he gave it all. He gave it all in one extravagantly merciful spiritual supply that flowing, well, there is a fountain filled with blood that's drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunged beneath that flood lose all their guilty stains. And when I saw his bleeding wounds that his blood supplied, this is his merciful, extravagant, spiritual supply to us, and he deserves our honor and our praise and our glory. Glory to Jesus for his extravagant, merciful provision and spiritual supply to us. So was it enough? Was it enough? It leads us to our next contrast in this scene of natural versus spiritual sufficiency. Verses 12 through 15. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. And when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is come into the world." And perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. And what looked to everyone around Jesus that day, nothing more than just a meager meal, that little amount of bread and fish. It might have fed a person or two. Once it was in Jesus' hands, it became more than enough for everyone. 12 baskets of leftovers, not little tiny Easter baskets. 12 baskets of leftovers, one each to represent the 12 tribes of Israel and the Old Covenant. 12 baskets of leftovers, one each to represent the 12 disciples and Jesus' global new covenant church. All of his people, not meager, more than enough. And the people's response was both fitting and not so fitting. They called him the prophet, meaning the one that Moses spoke of, and that was true. But then, seeing Jesus with only their natural eyes, these 50 to 20,000 people intended to start a revolt and a political uprising to essentially force Jesus to be the king that they wanted and to face off in force with the Roman occupiers. That's what they were getting ready to do. While he is king, Jesus is king, he's a far greater king than that. Much, much more was in store for them. Way beyond their passionate, I'm sure they were impassioned, I would have been impassioned too, but way beyond their passionate and petty notions at that moment. They didn't get the whole picture. A huge mob rushing into Jerusalem for Passover was not the way. Jesus would later go in riding on a colt, humble. Rushing into Jerusalem for Passover was not the way. That would lead to a far less sufficient end than the glorious and extravagant, spiritually sufficient end that God had in mind. And so Jesus withdrew from the mob. He withdrew from the mob alone. There were 20,000 people surrounding him. They were praising him. They were happy. And he had to withdraw from that alone. And then he would wait for the time when everyone, but a small few of his followers would shun and desert him, when he would be lifted up on another famous hillside and nailed to a cross on the hill of the skull. And it wouldn't be until then, it would be there on that hill, the hill of the skull, that the extravagance of God's merciful provision would show its extravagant spiritual sufficiency, not just for a few thousand of the friendliest people, but for all of rebellious mankind who were once enemies of God. Jesus himself, friend, take heart. Rest on this. Trust in this, stand upon this, cling to this. Jesus himself is more than enough for your true spiritual needs. I want to finish our time here together this morning, spending just a few minutes looking back over a few phrases from these 15 verses while focusing on natural versus spiritual sustenance. The first phrase I want to look at is back in verse 5. It says, lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him. Jesus' gaze went to those who needed him. His gaze went to those that he had drawn to himself. They were following him because of the things that he did for the sick. But he drew them. His gaze went to the spiritually curious, even the spiritually skeptical. His gaze went to the desperate and needy. His gaze went to the hungry. His gaze went to all of those without enough. With those with an ache, to those with an emptiness. And some of those folks went away that day with a full belly on natural sustenance, yet they eventually died apart from the spiritual provision that Jesus offered them with his life. They got full for one meal, for one day. and that was enough for them, or so they thought. But there were others who were hungrier than that. They were hungrier than that. Some went away also having taken the greater nourishment that Jesus offered, spiritual sustenance. They not only ate, they believed. They not only ate, they also believed. And in believing, they had life eternal. Jesus makes us the same offer this morning. Another phrase, actually, it's a pair of phrases, sort of contrasting phrases. Back in verse 9, remember what Andrew said? But what are they for so many? So let's look at that phrase versus a phrase in verse 11, as much as they wanted. What are they for so many on one side, and as much as they wanted on the other? What started out with doubt became an overwhelming abundance. And looking at these two phrases, friend, what you consider meager, God can make more than enough. Like the young boy here, trust God with what He has given you in the first place. Then give it back to Him and see how He will use it for others' good and His own glory. Something to keep in mind here. The boy gave it all away, but he ate too. Jesus didn't leave him hungry. So give Jesus your time, your meager amount of time. Give Jesus your talent, what you consider to be a meager amount of talent. And yes, give Him your treasure. But the greatest thing that you can give back to God is the very life that He has given to you. Jesus will meet your true needs, even when your needs surpass your resources. This got me, lump in the throat style this week. Jesus will meet your needs even when your needs surpass your resources, even when your needs surpass your skills and strength to resolve things on your own. I'm no plumber. I'm no mechanic. I can't resolve these problems on my own. I don't have the skills or the strength to do some of these things. But He will meet my needs even when my needs surpass my skill and my strength to resolve things for myself. And even when our network of friends and contacts isn't enough. I can't make a phone call and get someone over to solve my problem for me because my problem is bigger than that. But He is enough. He is more than enough. Brothers and sisters, what you have in your checking account, what you have in your savings account, what you have in your retirement account, if there's anything in there, it might seem insufficient for your needs in the here and now or your future needs. But don't just look at the cards that are face up on the table. He will meet the needs of His people. And when we give to Him what's already His, back to Him, His kingdom and the abundance of His spiritual sustenance in that kingdom will be uncountable, it will be immeasurable, and His extravagant mercy from His kingdom, from His supply, will be revealed for His glory and our good. Another lump in the throat moment for me this week. Your situation doesn't call for more of what you already have at hand. More money. It doesn't call for what you already have at hand. It calls for more of what you have in your heart, even if it's just a little. Faith in Jesus. So come to Him, just as the needy crowd came to Him. The fullness of Jesus' spiritual sustenance and mercy is available to you. Give yourself to Him, lean upon Him, and draw everything from Him. I invite you to meditate on this passage while also worshiping the Lord with this song, together, and then I'll come back up to close the message.